I had a request a while back. Maybe it was 2 minutes ago or a lifetime ago. I can't remember such things as time very well, but it was to do a video on death. And so I can't do a video on death, but I can do a video on the thinking mind's version of death because that's really what most of us are dealing with. And you might remember when the Buddha was asked about death, he just said he's never died before, so he has no clue. So he's stuck with immediate experience. But that's not the way most of us work with our minds. And if you've ever had, as an example, like a work situation where you got inspired and sent out some mission statement to the whole workplace, and it was a little risky, and so you laid in bed and you couldn't sleep that night because you just couldn't, all these possible scenarios ran through your head. And in the same way, so I've been doing these videos on how we create things. It's not just things, it's also scenarios and outcomes and conclusions and beliefs about, in fact, the whole concept of certainty itself is in a way kind of a thing that we create. And you felt very certain in these, but in this case, it really created fear and anxiety. And then you went to work the next day and none of it happened. So, maybe they just forgot about it, or maybe some email uh, bug was in there, and then they never even got any of this stuff that you were worrying about. And then you made a promise to yourself. I think a lot of us do this. We promise to ourselves, that's it. I'm never going to worry again about something silly. Well, how did that hold up? Probably not for very long, because it worked in that scenario because you could look backward and see how you could see the mechanics and how they turned out. But you don't have that luxury. And the thinking mind is again facing an unknown future, and it fills that gap with what it thinks are uh, possible knowns, and those are causing you the anxiety. So that's the real interesting paradox about the thinking mind. The thinking mind simultaneously craves certainty, and at the same time it creates the illusion of certainty. And when we get that, sometimes we feel anxious because we're certain we're going to go to work tomorrow and it's going to be a catastrophe. But at the same time, there's often we have the feeling of certitude, and it creates that dopamine rush. We feel, okay, finally I'm going to replace whatever you think is going to happen, and it feels good. So the thinking mind is all about things. And that's the problem with death. We don't know. It's kind of the great unknown. No one really knows what's going to happen. So the thinking mind steps in and it fills it with all kinds of things that it thinks might happen. But for just a moment, consider the possibility that whatever death is, it's nothing like you think it will be. Now, to give you a feel for this and how limited thinking mind is, and how the thinking mind takes reality and characterizes it so much. So it's like a cartoon version that we're absolutely certain is real. Let's just take, instead of talking about death, let's talk about life. And let's take the thinking mind's version of life and how absurd it is. And so the thinking mind's version, it goes something like this. If you just kind of combine science and what we know, and so, what is it, 13 billion years ago, out of nothing, complete nothingness, not even the rules of physics at the time, not even empty space, but pure, absolute nothingness, something that's happened. And we have no clue why, but there's a giant explosion of the Big Bang. And then all of that suddenly, from this kind of soup of energy, matter formed, and then planets, and then stars, and then suddenly, you know, life evolved on planets, and then they grew brains with eyes that could see and ears that could hear, and then out of these brains, consciousness emerged, and from consciousness, suddenly, sophisticated humans started walking around with cell phones, and then here you are, and so you are here suddenly, and that's the thinking mind's version of the story. And there's a certain kind of absurdity to that. The thinking mind just shows you how the thinking mind will take any uncertainty and fill it with a void, and will fill it with a thing, just for that feeling of certitude, even though you realize that the story is filled with holes. I mean, how does something emerge from nothing? And how does life emerge from matter? I mean, these are all great mysteries that we just have no clue, but just the story itself, if we the thinking mind feels satisfied because it's taken the void and it's filled it with enough things that it feels comfortable. And that's what we're doing with death. We're taking what is absolutely an unknown, and we're filling it with things that we think are known. And so, just to give you a feel for this, think about sleep. And so we sleep every night, most of us, if we're lucky, and it really feels like you're gone. So in deep sleep, it really feels like you're off. Like consciousness is gone, and for some people they'll say, well, that's exactly what death is. You're not around, and so and we try to even kind of calm our fears of death with that and say, well, it's just going to be like going to sleep. And people will say that. You're just going to sleep for a very long time without waking up. But the interesting thing about that is sleep is interesting. Deep sleep. I'm not talking about dreams, because in dreams and REM sleep, you're conscious in the typical sense that the thinking mind is on, conjuring up things again. But in deep sleep, the fascinating thing about it is the thinking mind is not present. But you, as in underlying consciousness, may be. Now, that may sound very strange to people. Say, well, how could I be conscious when I'm sleeping? Well, think of it this way. When you wake, you still have a very general memory that you slept. You just don't have any of the particular things to fill it with. And then when we dream, we might remember our dreams. And so that feels more like we're conscious. But during deep sleep, it feels like we're unconscious because we just don't have anything that's happening. Well, maybe that's really what death is. Death is just the death of the thinking mind. And so, one of the ways to really deal with the fear of death, particularly for people who struggle with this, is to realize that it's only the thinking mind that fears death, because the thinking mind fears anything that's unknown. And the thinking mind is continuously trying to fill that void with things and potential outcomes. And honestly, it would rather be stressed over a conclusion that it thinks is going to happen than admit that it just doesn't know I mean, it's impossible to fear something that you don't know what it is. So it will create ideas and to replace that, and then convince you that this is something to be afraid of. So the thinking mind is kind of like, like a shoe or something. We try it on, it feels like it's ours, and we own it. But it's also kind of one of those things when you really focus on meditation and when you focus on getting to know the thinking mind. That's the whole trick about all of this. To really understand how the thinking mind isn't who you are, you have to get to know the thinking mind. You have to get to know how it works, how it functions, how it creates things. And then you realize it's just like the shoe, you can take it off and it's not who you are. And the easiest way to realize that while there is the fear of death, that isn't who you are. It's just part of the mind program, it's part of thinking mind. And so it's a really nice way to kind of sidestep the whole problem. So there isn't a problem because it's the thinking mind that creates the problems in the first place. When you realize you're not the thinking mind, then there is no problem.